Olá, tudo bem? Bem-vindo ao novo episódio do meu programa que mostra notícias de fora que têm relacionamento com a conjuntura brasileira. Essa semana, Sérgio Moro viajou para os Estados Unidos depois do escândalo Vaza Jato lançou, depois do que ele foi, os vazamentos do Greenwald mostrou que ele mentiu para o Senado. Ele foi por uma visita técnica, de acordo com o Diário da União, em que ele vai visitar diferentes agências de inteligência e policiamento nos Estados Unidos. Imagino que o primeiro item do pauta dele vai ser: gente, o que aconteceu com meu celular? Pode dar uma olhada? Falando sobre esse assunto, essa semana, a primeira reportagem que vou mostrar é exatamente isso. O que os gringos estão achando sobre o Vaza Jato. Vou mostrar uma entrevista com o jornalista muito reconhecido, Mike Fox, que está morando atualmente no Brasil, com Greg Wilpert no The Real News sobre Vaza Jato. E o segundo reportagem que vou mostrar foi uma indicação de um telespectador, Ricardo Sturmer. Ele mandou um e-mail para a Gisele perguntando: por que você não pede para Brian legendar essa reportagem aqui do The Real News sobre como os americanos ajudou Hitler e os nazistas? Poucas pessoas sabem, mas grandes empresas estadunidenses apoiou os nazistas. Ford, GM, IBM e também o pai do George Bush pai, né, Prescott Bush. Ele foi processado por violação da lei contra fazendo negócios com o inimigo. Ele lucrou milhões. Aliás, a família do Bush, o dinheiro vem dos nazistas, basicamente, dos negócios ilegais que o avô do George Bush Jr. estava fazendo durante a Guerra Mundial II. Então, eu espero que vocês gostem do programa. Um abraço para todos e todas.
It's the Real News Network, and I'm Greg Wilpert in Baltimore. The website The Intercept released a series of articles last Sunday which provide strong evidence that last year's conviction and imprisonment of Brazil's former president Lula da Silva was politically motivated. The articles are based on an enormous archive of internal communications conducted by prosecutors and judges that The Intercept received from an anonymous source. The Intercept says that they will be publishing many more articles as they proceed to analyze the archive. Lula da Silva has been in prison for just over a year now, serving a 24-year prison sentence on corruption charges relating to the so-called Lava Jato or car wash corruption investigation, in which the construction companies Grupo OAS and Odebrecht were at the center. Lula was convicted shortly before last year's presidential campaign, in which he was the leading candidate. It is generally believed that Lula's disqualification from the race is what enabled far-right politician Jair Bolsonaro to win Brazil's presidency. Joining me now from Florianópolis, Brazil, to discuss the latest revelations contained in The Intercept's reporting is Mike Fox. Mike is a freelance reporter for the Real News Network and for many other media outlets. Thanks for joining us today, Mike.
Thanks for having me, Greg.
So the articles that were published in The Intercept raised two main issues with regard to Lula's conviction and his presidential run last year. Let's take them one at a time. Now, first there is the issue of how prosecutors tried to prevent Lula from giving an interview to Brazil's largest newspaper, Folha de São Paulo. What is the revelation here, and what is the significance of what prosecutors did?
Right, so it was in September 28th of last year, the Supreme Court ruled that Lula would be allowed to give this interview. Almost immediately thereafter, what we've seen from these telegram messages is that prosecutors in the Lava Jato task force kind of blew up, scheming for the next 24 hours about how they could possibly stop this. They called this mafioso, they called this ridiculous, insane. It was very clear about their political identification and what they were trying to do in order to move to block this interview, for their fear that the Workers' Party, this could kind of lift the Workers' Party forward into the first round and into the second round elections to potentially win the election. In the end, the interview itself was blocked by an appeal from Novo, one of the right-wing political parties. So they expressed that they were relieved in these telegram messages. So this is just a very clear example of a situation where these prosecutors were actively plotting to try and block as much as possible the Workers' Party from potentially returning to power.
So the second issue that the Intercept articles highlight has to do with the evidence against Lula and how the judge in Lula's case, Sergio Moro, and the main prosecutor, Deltan Dallagnol, communicated with each other to make a case against Lula. Now, what did the Intercept find here?
Right, so this is potentially even more damning. It's important to remember that Brazilian justice system is very similar to the United States. A judge is supposed to be impartial. He accepts the information from the prosecution and then from the defense and makes his decision. But what's clear from these telegram messages is that he was actually working hand in hand with the prosecutors in the case against Lula. What came out from here is he was helping to collaborate. He was kind of making recommendations that Deltan and his team should maybe reinvert the direction of the investigations that they were going on to. At one point in the messages, he says, nothing's happened for a month. You guys need to get moving. You guys to get out in the street and continue these investigations. And so he was actually collaborating with the prosecution. There's even one point in which he says, we need to work harder. I don't remember the exact quote that he used, but using the we means that he is actually in collaboration with the prosecution in this case, and he is himself supposed to be an independent judge. And that's what he always said. He always called himself impartial. And in fact, there was an interview that was tweeted out by Glenn Greenwald yesterday or today, in which it was a piece of a speech that he gave, in which he said, listen, I'm completely impartial. I'm completely impartial in this situation. But here from these messages, it becomes very clear that that is not the case. And this is not something that's absolutely new. I mean, we've known around this in Brazil. Many people have known this for a very long time. But what's so clear about this is it's on paper, right? We now see the messages and we see the collaboration. What you also have is a situation where Deltan Dallagnol, who's the lead prosecutor with the task force, actually came out at one point in messaging with Sergio Moro saying, listen, I don't think there's enough evidence to convict Lula. And he was also concerned about the location, why Lula would be tried within the larger Vaza Jato investigation. So why would it be Sergio Moro that would be trying him? So this is another thing that became very clear within these messages, that even the lead prosecutor didn't think they had enough evidence in order to be able to convict him.
I think it's also important to note that Sergio Moro himself, then after prosecuting Lula, convicting Lula, he then went on to become a justice minister for Jair Bolsonaro, which also, again, would not have been possible if Lula hadn't been convicted, or presumably wouldn't, because Lula might have won the presidential election.
Absolutely. And there's a very interesting, I think we're going to see more about that specific point in the coming weeks. I mean, we know that the Intercept has only gone through roughly 1% of the total messages that they've received. So this is the tip of the iceberg. And Glenn Greenwald has alluded to the fact that they may have some information that even before the elections, Sergio Moro had already spoken with Bolsonaro about this potential Minister of Justice position, and that he may have already accepted.
Wow. Now, what have been the reactions to this in Brazil? No doubt, of course, Lula's supporters feel vindicated, but what are his opponents saying about the revelations, and what has been the media's reaction to it?
Well, Sergio Moro obviously has come out defending himself. He said that, on one hand, the leaks were made illegally, so they were acquired illegally, and that the Intercept should not have published it without naming who actually acquired the documents, the messages. And that has been kind of overall, they've been talking about how since these leaks, since we don't know who gave them, they've been really focusing on kind of the illegality of acquiring the leaks. Many other people, for instance, Bolsonaro's own son, Eduardo, has come out and basically called them fake news. He's been talking about how he believes they may be manipulated or just a move in order to try and taint the Bolsonaro government at a moment in which it's fairly weak. Obviously, there have been the very large protests that have been growing against the education cuts. We've got a general strike plan for this Friday. And so they kind of see it within that context. In that same, in the same interview, Eduardo Bolsonaro admitted that he hadn't read these leaks. And that's been one of the things that's come out. The very first day, these were released on Sunday. And that very same day, the Vaza Jato prosecution team came out and basically confirmed that these were legitimate messages. They denied that they were scathing. They deny that they were in any way show that there was collusion between the prosecution and the judge in this case. But they admitted that they were legitimate, and that's one thing that a lot of people, kind of Bolsonaro supporters or supporters of Judge Sergio Moro, have not been talking about. And obviously, the Bolsonaro supporters have been very, very vocal on social media, defending the Lava Jato, defending the investigations, defending Sergio Moro, and defending Bolsonaro. It's important to put into context how important Sergio Moro is for recent years in Brazil. This is the man who led the largest corruption investigation in the history of Brazil. And for the right, he was very much seen as kind of a superhero. I mean, he was expected to be the man who would get the next post on the Supreme Court, and his name has even been floated for potential presidency for the 2022 elections. Obviously, in this case right now, as many analysts have been talking about, that those chances are becoming extremely decreased because, Moro is, and this is what analysts are saying, is that he, of everyone, of all of kind of the scandal, the leaks that have come out of this, he's the one who's really become most wrapped up in this. And that means that they're questioning his agenda as Minister of Justice. And that means even in questions about the decisions he made while he was a judge at the head of this investigation. So this is really huge, and it goes across the board, going back years.
And so finally, how do you think this might, or is there any indication how this might influence Lula's case and possibly his appeals?
It's a great question. We have just this morning, one of the Supreme Court justices said that the evidence released in these leaks could potentially be used in order to question or overturn decisions by Judge Sergio Moro when he was a judge at the head of the Lava Jato investigations. So that is one very important detail. The Supreme Court is literally this afternoon supposed to be hearing a case, an appeal over freeing Lula, over Lula's case. So that's something that's coming up. We're going to be watching very closely. It's really hard to say where things go from here. Overall, obviously, like I mentioned, only 1% of the messages have been, not the messages have been released, but only 1% of the messages have been gone through. So there's a lot of information. We know that 5 different political parties, the major left parties, the PT, the PSOL, have already said that they're going to block anything they possibly can in Congress until steps have been taken against prosecutors in the Lava Jato team that have been doing the investigations here. We know that the Public Prosecutor's Office, the National Council Public Prosecutor's Office, has already moved to sanction some of those prosecutors. That was as of this morning. They began the investigations yesterday. They said that 5 people have been temporarily suspended. So we know that is happening. The Bar Association, the Brazilian Bar Association, has called for both Moro and Delta and Dallagnol to step down because of their implications within all this. And like I said, this is just the beginning. It is the major news, and we believe it's going to continue to grow in the coming days and the coming weeks.
Wow. Well, we'll definitely come back to you as this case develops and as it explodes in Brazil. But we're going to leave it there for now. I was speaking to Mike Fox, freelance reporter based in Florianópolis, Brazil. Thanks again, Mike, for having joined us today.
Thanks, Greg.
And thank you for joining the Real News Network.
Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay. On June 6, 1944, the Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, France, in opening a second front against German fascism. The largest contingents of fighters were British, American, and Canadian. This battle has been depicted in movies and books as the decisive turning point of World War II, a ferocious struggle against a superior enemy. Here's Donald Trump in London speaking about D-Day and the triumph of those soldiers.
On June 6th, 1944, tens of thousands of young warriors left these shores by the sea and air to begin the invasion of Normandy and the liberation of Europe and the brutal Nazi occupation. It was a liberation like few people have seen before. Among them were more than 130,000 American and British brothers in arms, Through their valor and sacrifice, they secured our homelands and saved freedom for the world.
No doubt, the soldiers who sacrificed in the tens of thousands killed and wounded did wage a valiant and courageous fight. My father was in the Canadian Air Force attached to the RAF and was part of a mission to arm and support the French partisans. Most of my father's fellow airmen were killed. Like many vets, my dad did not like talking about the war, and he was not filled with stories of triumph and heroism, although surely he and millions of others were such heroes. But was D-Day the dramatic turning point in the war? Was the role of the United States the critical difference in the defeat of the Nazis? And what really drove the decisions that led to so much horror and death? Now joining us from Washington is Peter Kuznek. He's a professor of history and director of Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. He's the author of The Untold History of the United States, co-written with Oliver Stone, as well as Rethinking the Atomic Bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Thanks for joining us, Peter.
Hi, Paul.
So before we get into D-Day and what happened there and what the significance of D-Day was, I think there's sort of a bigger backstory here about the rise of Hitler and Hitlerite militarism. And I always understood that the Versailles Treaty after the end of World War I, one of the most important parts of that treaty was that Germany should never be allowed to rearm. And the Second World should never have been possible. What happened?
Well, that's actually a long and complicated story. Partly that also is a product of World War I. You have to remember that in the aftermath of the war, there was such strong anti-war sentiment throughout Europe and throughout in the United States that people were very, very loath to get involved in another war. And they were willing to tolerate things they perhaps shouldn't have. The attitude in the United States was that the United States had been effectively suckered into the war by the munitions manufacturers and the bankers. That instead of it being a noble cause to make the world safe for democracy or to fight the war to end all wars, it was really a war to secure the vast Morgan loans to the British and the French, and a way to fatten the coffers of DuPont and the other munitions makers.
And this is, you're talking about the First World War.
Yeah, the First World War. Because there's such strong anti-war sentiment that nobody really wants to get involved in another war in Europe in the 1930s. So they tolerate German rearmament in ways that they shouldn't have, even though they were aware this was taking place. And as you know, it was more than just tolerating it. The American manufacturers were involved in helping it happen. One of my PhD students recently completed an excellent dissertation about the role of GM, IBM, and Ford in rebuilding the German economy in the 1930s and helping directly, in the case of GM and Ford, with German rearmament. They were willing to do things to support the German military that they were not willing to do to rearm in the United States during this period. And they stayed involved in ways that really defied U.S. law up until the war actually began. And then during the war, their subsidiaries in Europe continued to produce, continued to make profits, which they were able to accrue after the war ended. In fact, GM and Ford were able to sue the U.S. government for millions of dollars for reparations for their plants that the U.S. bombed and destroyed in Europe during the war that were producing for the Nazis. So American business had a shameful record.
And if we talk about the story of Henry Ford, because it's not just Henry Ford, the sections of the American elites, the British elites, including the King of England, who we now know didn't step down because of his marriage to an American woman. He really stepped down because he was so pro-Hitler. He became an embarrassment. And Henry Ford himself gets some kind of award from Hitler.
Yes, Henry Ford got an award. Henry Ford there were some good things one might say about Henry Ford, but we have to also know that he was viciously anti-union and that he was a vicious anti-Semite. His newspaper reprinted the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, helped popularize that myth, that falsity throughout America, spewed anti-Semitism in his publications and his personal life. Hitler had a portrait of Henry Ford above his desk in his office, and Hitler said, "Henry Ford is my hero." And that was in part because of his anti-Semitism and a lot of his other reactionary ideas. That
Henry Ford used to send Hitler money on his birthday every year.
And then the Germans did give Henry Ford an award, and Henry Ford was happy to accept it. He later tries to change the record and say that he wasn't a supporter of Hitler, but the Ford Motor Company was doing Germany's bidding. But it wasn't just that. It was Prescott Bush, who was the uncle of George Bush, and father and grandfather, who was very much instrumental in working with Brown Brothers Harriman, and got called on the carpet for this during the war with the Trading with the Enemies Act. So there are a lot of American elites who were involved in helping finance and helping rearm and helping rebuild the German economy during this period. It's a shameful episode. Oliver and I go into it in some depth in the documentary Untold History and the book of Untold History, because we think it's a very important story that gets swept under the carpet when we're talking about these people being the greatest generation. But a lot of those folks who we call the greatest generation were Nazi enablers. And many of them saw the Nazis as a bulwark against Bolshevism, as against communism, and were therefore happy and willing to support and allow and tolerate and turn a blind eye to the rearmament of Germany during this time, because they saw the Nazis as the way to stop the communists in the Soviet Union.
And wasn't that really that was the big underlying strategy, wasn't? They thought that the Germans would march east, not west, and that if there was a war with Germany and Russia, that would just be a hunky-dory for the West to let the Germans and the Russians kill each other.
Well, among those who explicitly stated that was Senator Harry Truman, who on the floor of the Senate said, if the Germans are winning, we should support the Russians, and if the Russians are winning, we should support the Germans, and that way let them kill as many of each other as possible. That was not Roosevelt's attitude. But we had chances to intervene to prevent this. One of the key episodes in the rise of fascism, the spread of fascism, was the Spanish Civil War. And the U.S. maintained a dumb neutrality in the Spanish Civil War. Again, this was a product of the strong hatred of World War I and the deep anti-war sentimentism, which was normally would be a positive sentiment. We wish we had more of that in the United States today. But during the 1930s, this was a chance to stop Hitler. And the U.S. maintained its neutrality throughout the Spanish Civil War. The only nation that was really supporting the Spanish Republic was the Soviet Union.
And that was the Spanish Republic was the elected government overthrown by the fascist Franco, backed by Hitler. And in fact, Hitler uses the Spanish Civil War as a way to show off his air force and his new military ability and test some of his weapons. I mean, an obvious place to intervene if they actually wanted to stop fascism in Europe.
Well, and Roosevelt looked back on it and said we were going to rue the day when we didn't intervene to stop Hitler when we had the chance. There were a number of times when we could have stopped Hitler. But number one, people didn't want to go to war. Number two, they downplayed the threat that Hitler represented, even though Hitler lays this out explicitly in Mein Kampf. He talks about taking over the Soviet Union. He talks about populating the Ukraine. I mean, he lays out his plans very, very clearly, but people didn't want to take it seriously. And then we pay the price for that. So sometimes it is necessary to fight, and we do have to be vigilant. But what complicates it, of course, is the post-war history, where the Cold War was, as we've talked about, extraordinarily dangerous and unnecessary and avoidable. And the U.S. interventions repeatedly militarily were not in the cause of freedom and stopping fascism, but were more often in the cause of spreading U.S. foreign policy goals and interests and intervening repeatedly on the wrong side in support of the oppressors, support of the militarists. We could go through that history, and we have before.
My understanding is the Soviet Union had been asking for the British and the Americans and Canadians to join a united front or a broad front, an alliance against Hitler as far back as 1939. And once the Germans did start directly engaging, fighting against the Soviet Union and began the invasion, Stalin kept asking over and over again for a second front to be opened in the West, and there wasn't much interest in it up until the defeat of the Germans at Stalingrad.
Yeah, and well, in fact, it goes back long before 1939, when the Soviets adopted the Popular Front strategy in 1935. That was an attempt to reach out to the liberal, progressive forces in the West for an anti-fascist alliance to stop Hitler in the mid-1930s. The Soviets saw what was coming, and they interpreted the West's refusal to ally against Hitler as a sign that the West was hoping that Hitler would move east, as he promised, against the Soviet Union and destroy communism. And the British side, Churchill says back after the Bolshevik Revolution that he wants to strangle Bolshevism in the cradle. You have to remember that the West sent troops into the Soviet Union in 1918 and 1919. And this was partly an effort to defeat the Russian Revolution. We've got the prolonged Russian Civil War as a response to that. And then the U.S. also sent more than 10,000 troops into Russia in 1918 and 1919. So this goes way back. The Brits, the Japanese, the French, they all had troops in there right after the Russian Revolution. They saw Bolshevism as a threat. And clearly the Bolsheviks were not playing by the rules. When the Bolsheviks released the diplomatic papers showing the Sykes-Picot Treaty and showing that the British and the French and the Russians had divided up the world after World War I, that World War I was really a war to make the world safe for colonialism, to redivide the world's colonies, not a war to make the world safe for democracy. It exposed the lie at the source of American involvement in World War I. Woodrow Wilson gets us involved because he wants to have a hand in shaping the post-war world. And he says so explicitly. He says, otherwise, we'll be forced to sit outside the door and try to shout through a crack under the door. Right. He says, we want to be involved with shaping the world. And the world that the British and the French shape after World War I is not a world opposed to colonies, is not a world of self-determination, not a world of freedom, not a world of democracy. It's a world of colonialism and repression, which is another reason why the Americans did not want to get involved in Europe. They saw the Europeans as corrupt. And Roosevelt says this explicitly in the 1930s and 1940s.
Okay, Peter.
He talks about British colonies in Gambia. He talks about the French colonies in Indochina. He talks about the British in India. And he says that this kind of repression cannot be tolerated after World War II. Unfortunately, Roosevelt dies, and Truman does allow the British and the French to reestablish their colonial domains after World War II.
Okay, in the next segment of our interview, we're going to talk more about D-Day and whether it was the decisive battle that broke the back of German fascism, German militarism. So please join us for that on the Real News Network.